Hello, David Reese Elementary. This is Karen Flores, and it is a pleasure to be reconnecting with you, even if it's via webinar. I hope everyone had a fabulous holiday and you are having a fantastic start to the 2017 school year. This webinar is going to talk about and review the role of text complexity in close reading, and we will walk through and review some of the components that make up a complex text so that we can be better consumers of selecting the right text to use instructionally with our kids. The reason that we need to talk about close reading when we are talking about text complexity is because you do a close read with a complex text. You want to ensure that the text is rich enough so that students have multiple opportunities to go in and reread, and each time reread for different purposes. It is also a key requirement of Common Core State Standards, and this is a shift enabled to an attempt to try and direct the reader's attention to the text in and of itself. And so if we know that text complexity is a component of a close read, I want to ensure that we also know the importance of why text complexity is a variable that we are talking about. On the slide right now, you're going to see 4 claims that are linked to the Smarter Balanced Assessment. And claim number 1 very specifically says that the students need to be able to read closely and analytically to comprehend a range of increasingly complex literary and informational texts. And so if we know that there is an external assessment that is going to hold our kids accountable to these demands, we as the educators in front of them on a day-to-day basis need to make sure that we're versed in what those components of text complexity entail. For our primary learners, I just want to reiterate a point that was made in December. We have kids in the K-2 grades who are still learning to read. They have not mastered the phonemic awareness. They're working on their fluency. I just want to make sure that we do not blur a child's ability to read and a child's ability to critically think. And so we want to ensure that we are having students encounter complex texts through listening, even while they're still learning to read and write. Just want to review the 3 components that make a text complex, and we'll talk a little bit further about each of these on the webinar. There are qualitative measures, quantitative measures, and a reader and task variable. Qualitative measures need to be assessed by the human eye. There is not a program or a platform that can do this. We're going to look at evaluating the meaning, the structure, the language conventionality and clarity, and the knowledge demands of a text. When you look into the quantitative realm, you're going to look at a word analysis and sentence structure. There is a fabulous tool that you can use to identify the quantitative measure of a text. It is just one tool, but it is free, and it is lexile.com, Lexile.com. This is a free resource where you can upload a sample of a text, and it will give you the Lexile measure for it. The final variable is the reader and task, and this is one that unfortunately is always going to have somewhat of a pretty large question mark, because it has to do with what your learners bring to the table in terms of their background knowledge, in terms of their motivation, in terms of their experiences. And because no 2 children are the same, this is a component that we always have to ensure that we're keeping our eye on, that we have a good pulse on. And this is something that the relationship building through students only helps empower you as the educator to know the components that fill that part of the triangle. So just as I mentioned just a moment ago, the quantitative factors when we're looking at the complexity of a text would be the word level analysis and the sentence level analysis. In vocabulary, there are different tiers of words. The more specific a vocabulary word gets to a specific domain or category, the higher tier it's going to have. The higher tier the vocabulary, the greater complexity level the text will have. The sentence level analysis is going to look at the length primarily of the sentence in and of itself. If there is a sentence that's using a lot of hyphens or semicolons or is connecting complete thoughts through commas instead of ending it with a period, that's a more difficult sequence for a reader to follow. And so that's something that we need to be aware of, is when we're selecting text. We do actually want to make sure that we're exposing our kids to some of those rich sentences, and in a close read, take the opportunity to pull apart and dissect that sentence so that when kids are encountered to it without our support, they have the capacity to navigate through it. Qualitative factors, again, just as I've mentioned earlier, are the elements of a text that can only be recognized by ourselves, by a human reader. When we talk about that, there are 4 factors of text when we talk about qualitative measures. The levels of meaning and purpose. Is it implied? Is it stated? Is it direct? That's not something that a computer program can tell us. The structure of the text is going to talk about and refer to things in terms of how it's ordered. Is it go in chronological order? Do we hear from multiple perspectives of characters? Does it start off with a flashback and then go into present day? Those are all components that would be inclusive under the structure category. When we talk about language, conventionality, and clarity, this is when we're going to not only look at the vocabulary that's being used, but we're going to look at how it's being used. Is the language archaic? Is the dialogue and the register very formal? Basically anything that is going to be outside of the norm of what our students are used to being exposed to in terms of vocabulary is going to be something that then should raise a flag to say, okay, hold on a minute, this is different, and how do I need to support and scaffold the instruction so that my readers can access this text? And then the knowledge demands is something that, again, this is going to somewhat tie to your reader and task variable, but it's going to be looking for specific pieces of what that literary piece is going to demand of the reader. What component is it going to draw upon so that the kids really need to pay attention to a specific piece or a specific section of the text in and of itself? What background knowledge do they have to be able to understand some of the content that's being delivered? The other piece that I want to make sure, and I kept this slide on here because it's a very real component in education. When we talk about text complexity and we talk about learners who may not come to us at grade level, that have some readability gaps, we have to be comfortable with allowing students to grapple, with allowing students to struggle. And we talked when we were together in December about constructive struggle and destructive struggle. There is a healthy and an unhealthy element to the struggle that we put in front of kids, and we need to be aware of it. Constructive struggle is going to be when we hold our kids to high demands, but there is also hope. There is an understanding that the teacher is a partner in the journey with the student. There is success criteria, so the student can see that they might not have arrived at mastery of the standard as a whole, but they know where they are at in the learning progression. Very, very important pieces to ensure that there is constructive struggle so that students don't feel defeated and retreat and become paralyzed in their learning instead of accepting and taking on the challenge because they know they have support and they know they have an understanding in terms of what success will look like for them. And so what we're going to move into, reviewing very quickly right now, is just understanding some of those components that actually make the text complex. We talked about the different variables, but let's go in and take a much closer look at some of the key pieces that we were exposed to when we utilized practicing with the text complexity rubric. Vocabulary, sentence structure, coherence, organization, and background knowledge. And even just looking at this list of 5, you should be able to draw some parallels to what we just talked about when we were walking through the triangle of what makes a text complex. And so we talked about this when we were together in December. Vocabulary is a very, very real variable. There was a study done, and dependent upon what socioeconomic class you are a part of, you will be exposed to 45 million words by the time you are 4 versus 13 million words by the time you are 4 if you are a family on welfare versus a professional class living family. This is something that we need to be very considerate of, because if a student doesn't have an ability to understand the vocabulary, we need to make sure that instructionally then we are equipping them with strategies in how to understand and determine the meaning of an unknown word or phrase. Sentence structure. This was something that we talked about earlier when looking at some of those quantitative and qualitative measures. It's how those words operate together. So just as we mentioned, as we discussed, if I have 5 sentences that all close with a period versus 5 sentences that are not 5 but blended as one and connected with semicolons or commas or hyphens, that puts a greater demand on me as a reader. My thought that I have to hang on to and dissect from the beginning to the end is going to shift because of the sheer nature in which the sentence is designed. Here's an example. The yellow snowblower that my father bought for my mother for their 15th wedding anniversary last year is now sitting in the garage under a pile of old boxes and newspapers where she left it that night just before she threw her mobile phone, the one with my picture on it, at Dad and burst into tears. It's a lot for a student to have to hang on to from the beginning of that sentence until the end. The more we are aware of it as their teacher, the more we can help them access it and get through it with success. Coherence. This is one that I think is probably pretty easy when you become a verse reader and you have a lot of strategies kind of on automaticity. But when we talk about coherence, we're talking about how words, ideas, and sentences, how all of those pieces connect together. And when we look at this sample right here, and we covered and shared this when we were together, John and Mary went to space camp. They liked it there. Of course, boys often like rockets, but Mary enjoyed it too. In this small sentence, and this isn't really even a sentence that's of any great length in terms of sentence structure, I still have a lot of things I need to know. I need to know that they is representative of John and Mary. I know it and there are kind of space camp. Those are the same places. Boys, when I look at, of course, boys, I have the word plural in terms of boys. However, in this case, I'm actually only referring to John. And then when I look at enjoyed it too, again, we're talking about it, we're talking about camp. And so while we look at this sentence and we think, oh, it's pretty easy, there really isn't anything too complex, when we look at the variable of coherence, it definitely presents some challenges that we may have not been aware of, or we may not have really been focusing on as potential barriers for why our students might struggle with a certain piece. The organization. This is, again, something that we've touched on earlier, but it's all about how that text is structured. And so you can see that there are things that might be stated directly to the reader, and there are other things that the reader is going to have to draw out and infer and do some implying through the clues that the author's already given them. We have to look at sequence, and then we have to also look at organizational structure. And then once we've identified what those components are, we can then start to say, okay, now that I know what the challenges are that this text represents around structure, around sequence, around what we have explicitly or implicitly stated, I can then begin to design instruction so that my kids, once again, can access the text that I'm putting in front of them. Background knowledge. This is your question mark, but what I can tell you and why I have two effect sizes up in green on this slide is because the power of student relationships and the power of teacher credibility, if you are effective at those two variables and you can really implement those influences and build those relationships and have that credibility with your kids, it's going to be paramount in helping you understand the background knowledge and what the knowledge of that the text demands in terms of background knowledge and what the knowledge is of your kids, and then how those two components are going to blend into one world together. The final piece that I'm going to share with you, and just bring a reminder, in your folder that Dave and I created for you that has resources from our time together in December, there are rubrics, and there is a rubric for literary text, and there is also a rubric for informational text. The one we're looking at right now is for literary. I strongly, strongly encourage you to continue to use this tool and continue as a PLC, with your colleagues, sit down and go through an analysis of a text. There's going to be a lot of positivity from that. You're going to hopefully begin to go from practice and learning to somewhat of transfer. You're going to begin to become a better consumer of the text that you are selecting. And you're going to really start to be able to thoughtfully think about how we can use text for very different purposes, because what you'll discover, and I think this was something that presented itself in our professional development opportunity in the past, is that very rarely, unless you're going at the very, very high end of text complexity, you're not going to find a text that's going to fit into the 3-point or stretch category for every component. So it might be a 3 points for density and complexity, but maybe for figurative language it's a 2. And so when you can do an analysis of a text in this manner and you can look at the complexity levels kind of categorically, it really does equip you and put you in a better position to select the right text and then engage in the right type of learning activity with your students. So as always, if there are any questions or if there are additional resources or you just need to have a conversation, please make sure that you don't hesitate to reach out to either myself or to Dave, because this was, while we had an opportunity to engage in some learning together, it is something that we hope we have the opportunity to support and develop moving forward as well. So thank you.